Welcome back to the Americas Identity, Culture, and Power. In this class, we're trying to give you an entirely new perspective that's appropriate for a new century. We're trying to offer a course that is truly interdisciplinary, truly multicultural, truly hemispheric, and above all, a course that is critical and reflects upon key issues that we need to ponder as we enter a new century. Many of you have been concerned about an upcoming examination, and so we're going to begin today, before we cut to the quick, with a brief review of some of the issues and themes that you need to be familiar with. If we could have the overhead projector, please. First of all, we want you to focus on key concepts, key ideas, key themes, key controversies, and key interpretations. These are what are fundamental. That's what you should be focusing on. Our midterm exam will include multiple choice questions, identification questions, and essay questions. So let's think about some of the issues that you should be concentrating on. If we could have the overhead projector again. Each class is built around a key question or a key controversy. For example, in our first class, we asked, how did Europe, Africa, and the Americas compare and contrast in 1492? You should be aware of differences and similarities in population size, urbanization, economies, governmental structures, religions, and cultural achievements. The basic argument that I presented was that it is incorrect to believe that Africa was more tribal than Europe in 1492, that it was less developed than Europe. We looked at such areas as mining, metallurgy, civil engineering, textile manufacture, glass making, ceramics, irrigation, and chemicals to challenge myths of African backwardness. We also challenged certain myths about the New World, that it was largely unpopulated virgin land, that prior to European discovery, its inhabitants were hunters on horseback or largely nomadic bands. What we saw was that the indigenous peoples of the Americas created empires, cities, long-distance trade, monumental architecture, productive systems of agriculture, and developed some of the world's most important food crops. And finally, we looked at certain European weaknesses and strengths in 1492. In particular, we emphasized Europe's involvement in long-distance oceanic trade, the missionary character of European religion, the eagerness with which Europe assimilated items developed by other cultures, and a peculiar mixture that characterized Europe 1492, a strong nationalism combined with an intensive sense of identity, product of a long struggle with Islam. In our second class, we asked two key questions. Why was the Spanish conquest so successful? And secondly, a dominant literary form of the conquest period, the captivity narrative, and what it tells us about European perceptions and attitudes. We critically examined alternative explanations of Spanish success. Professor Castaneda looked at explanations that emphasize technology, ideology and culture, disease, and the manipulation of social divisions. And then he went into the consequences of the conquest: disease, depopulation, a massive food exchange, the transatlantic slave trade, and changes in the ecology as a result of new cash crops and mining. Professor Dorothy Baker then examined the captivity narratives, which were the most popular form of fiction in the 17th and 18th centuries, We contrasted the surface text of these captivity narratives, which emphasize the author's piety and Indians as symbols of evil, with the subterranean, the hidden text, which offered revealing glimpses into the attractions of indigenous life. And finally, we ended by looking at the ambiguities of conquest, and you should be aware of the examples of Pocahontas, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and the 1680 Indian Rebellion in New Mexico as instances where conquest is not simply a one-way street, but results in a negotiated compromise. Our third class on slavery raised a number of questions that you should be prepared to answer. How did New World slavery, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, differ from slavery in the ancient world and in the non-Western world? Why did slavery become the dominant labor force in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the American South? Why were New World slaves obtained from sub-Saharan Africa? How did slavery contribute to the growth of a modern economy? How did slavery in Latin America differ from slavery in the American South? How did Afro-Americans throughout the Americas resist slavery? And in our last class, we looked at issues of development and underdevelopment. Why did the northeastern United States industrialize in the decades before the Civil War, and the American South and Latin America did not? A key question that you should be asking yourself is, why did the use of unfree labor seem to impede the growth of cities, retard technological innovation, and inhibit the development of internal markets? A last few points before we move on. Points of contrast between Spanish and English colonization. Spain moved quickly to subjugate native peoples and to establish a centralized bureaucracy to administer its empire. Britain never established a centralized colonial administration. From the start, the Spanish crown exerted central authority. It tried to dominate every aspect of life, religious, economic, so forth. In contrast, England exercised little control beyond the docks and custom houses. When the Spanish Empire finally collapsed in the early 19th century, there were few alternative institutions of self-government ready to take over. Provincial assemblies, municipal governments, and other alternative centers of power had been eliminated or reduced in power. Second, the Spanish viewed the Indian population as a usable labor force. In general, the English had no real view of peaceful coexistence between colonists and Indians. They simply coveted Indian land. Extermination or removal of Indians was not a real possibility in Latin America, even after devastation by disease. Indians were regarded instead as vassals to be protected, Christianized, and taxed. But north of Mexico, the Indian population was much more loosely spread out, and extermination and removal were a real possibility. Third, a far larger number of English migrated to the New World. Only about 160,000 Spanish migrated to the New World, and almost all were male. Many more English migrated, and they included many women. One of the pleasures of this class is because it is truly interdisciplinary, it allows us to bring some of the best lecturers and scholars of the entire university. Today, we're very fortunate to have Cynthia Freeland, who's Associate Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts, and a winner of the University of Houston's Teaching Excellence Award. She is a specialist in philosophy, and she's also served as director of the University of Houston's Women's Studies program. And today she'll be doing something that I think you'll find quite innovative. She's going to talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson, but not in the way Ralph Waldo Emerson used to be treated, as a sort of saint, but from a variety of critical perspectives that I think you'll find quite fascinating. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson, as you no doubt already know, was a minister, a philosopher, and a poet who was the leading U.S. intellectual of the 19th century. There's no way of knowing how much influence Ralph Waldo Emerson actually had on anyone. But we do know that countless Americans would quote his words and would sigh to his sentiments. He would be quoted by radicals, but his words would also be framed on the boardrooms of corporate headquarters. But none of this would have surprised Ralph Waldo Emerson. To be great, he said, is to be misunderstood. He was often criticized for being inconsistent, and he said to that, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." Now, why should we talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson? Isn't he simply another one of those dead white males of no interest any longer? I think there's three key reasons we need to think about him. First of all, Ralph Waldo Emerson and his generation were the first people to confront a series of questions that we still try to make sense of today. Questions of vocation, of what kind of life should we lead? Questions of meaning in a world filled with evil. How can we have faith in anything? And questions of social criticism. How should we criticize and reform the world we live in? In other words, Emerson confronted the head of problems that we're now facing the tail end. There are two other issues that I think Emerson raises that are important for our class. One we will call the issue of post-colonial culture. The United States was the first colonial nation in modern history to win its independence through revolution. But it took a long time for the country to achieve cultural independence. Political independence came first. Up until the 1850s, the U.S.'s culture was largely derivative of England. But in 1837, Ralph Waldo Emerson issued this country's Cultural Declaration of Independence. In a famous speech called The American Scholar, he called on Americans to stop imitating Europeans, speak with their own voices, and create art from their own experience. And so this issue of creating a distinctive culture would be one of the issues that Emerson would be at the forefront of. It's a peculiarly modern question. The second issue that Emerson deals with that I think is very relevant to this course is that he is the man more than anyone else who formulated the modern U.S. philosophy of individualism. Routine, materialism, compromise, and conformity dominate most people's lives, in Emerson's view. What people need, he thought, was genuine self-reliance, genuine independence, independence of mind, and independence of cravings for wealth and power. Emerson is truly the prophet of American individualism. Now, it's easy to think that Emerson was a product of the 19th century and his world is gone, but that actually is wrong, I think. A very popular set of ideas in America today is New Age philosophy. And I would suggest to you that New Age philosophy is simply updated, perhaps even warmed over, Emerson. Emerson's philosophy was called American Transcendentalism, and it combined a peculiarly American enthusiasm for self-improvement and social renewal with the belief that there are divine energies and spiritual forces abiding in the self and flowing through the universe. And that idea should sound very familiar to you all, I think, because it's the same notion that New Age philosophers also cultivate. That is, that the goal of New Age philosophy is the same goal that Emerson put forward 150 years ago, to cultivate each person's awareness of his or her potential, to overcome dualisms between humanity and nature, the divine and the human, and to strengthen intuition and imagination. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Cynthia Freeland. Thank you, Cynthia.
Happy to be here. Thank you. I'd like to get the computer screen, if I could, please. The first thing I would like to tell you is that you don't need to really rush a lot and take notes during my lecture today, because everything is on the web. So the one thing that you might want to write down is the address that's in blue here on the screen, and this is the address of the location of all these notes on my website. The topic that I was asked to speak about by Dr. Mintz for your class today was American modernism, the sort of origins, the foundations, the intellectual grounding of modernism in the United States, in North America in particular. And the way I've chosen to approach this is by assigning a reading, and I know some of you have not yet managed to get to this reading, but perhaps some of you in the home audience have, from a book by Cornel West, The American Evasion of Philosophy, A Genealogy of Pragmatism. And if I could just, I will hold up the book so that the audience can just look at it. In fact, I can put it down on the pad here. And you can just get a glance of it. This is A Genealogy of Pragmatism, and Cornel West is a philosopher. I'll tell you more about him in just a moment. And it's a genealogy of a distinctively American philosophical point of view. That's what West is writing about in this book. And in particular, the chapter from his book that I've asked you all to read is his first chapter, and that's his chapter on Emerson, and that's on, if we could go back to the computer screen, please, The Emersonian Prehistory of American Pragmatism. So the first thing I would like to talk about is a little bit of background about who is Cornel West, and why are we looking at him in particular as an expositor of the philosophy of Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose importance you've heard about in the introduction by Professor Mintz. Well, let me say a little bit about Cornel West. Cornel West is a philosopher. He was educated at Harvard, and he's something of an intellectual prodigy. And what I mean by saying that is that he went to Harvard when he was 17. He completed Harvard in 3 years, summa cum laude, with a major in Near Eastern Studies, taking 16 courses in his final year. And then he went to Princeton, where he earned a PhD in philosophy and theology. And by the age of 42, he had written and published 11 books. And this is one of them. This is one of the better known of them, that one that I'm talking about, The American Evasion of Philosophy. And he's a very prominent African-American intellectual who now holds a position in the Afro-American Studies program at Harvard University. Not only is he a prominent philosopher, theologian, and African-American intellectual, but he also deems himself a public intellectual who's following up in the tradition of Ralph Waldo Emerson And so one of the terms that he uses to describe Emerson is to say that Emerson is an organic intellectual. And that's one of the terms that we're going to want to try to grapple with here. What does it mean to call someone an organic intellectual? And I've chosen to discuss West because he does discuss Emerson as a kind of spiritual father, although he certainly has many criticisms to make and a good deal of ambivalence about Emerson. So let me say a little bit more about why Cornel West. What is it about him? Let me move up a little bit more. He traces the path of modernism from Europe to America by focusing on Emerson. And so he will use Emerson and argue that Emerson is a philosopher responding to the European intellectual tradition of philosophy, and that's where the whole movement of modernism is rooted. We'll come back to that in just a moment. He focuses on Emerson as the author of a peculiarly American intellectual identity, and this identity will grow and flourish into the movement that we know as pragmatism, and that includes subsequent figures you may have heard of, such as William James and John Dewey. Third, Emerson is a distinctive figure. He's very hard to locate in a discipline. This is one reason he's so interesting. He is arguably a philosopher, a person who has a lot to say on religion and even assumes a kind of prophetic tone. He speaks to and for the arts, and in particular for literature. And he also is an expositor and a developer of a kind of viewpoint on the individual personality that Dr. Mintz mentioned with his sort of grounding of the American attitude toward individualism. And finally, I'm looking at Emerson through the lens of Cornel West because West's attitude is critical. So we're not just getting naked, naive adulation, we're getting a kind of tempered view of this important intellectual forefather. Now let me say just one more word about Cornel West, and then we'll move on to what he says on Emerson. I've mentioned those 11 books. There may be more by now, I'm not sure. But here are some of his other books, and I do have these books with me, so I may just show one of them in a minute here as well. Breaking Bread is one that I would recommend because in this book he has a kind of friendly, somewhat informal conversation with the African-American female intellectual and feminist Bell Hooks. And then there's a 2-volume book called Prophetic Reflections, and if we could have the overhead for a minute, I've got the cover here just to give you a sample of some of his other books. Prophetic Reflections, Notes on Race and Power in America. There's a companion volume to this, Prophetic Thought in Postmodern Times, Beyond Eurocentrism and Multiculturalism. And then the final book that I want to recommend, I think is a very philosophically rich book, and that is this work, Keeping Faith, Philosophy and Race in America. And this is an interesting, it has a number of interesting essays in which West talks about the difficult position of being an African-American intellectual who is marginalized from the traditions of the white European academy, but also through being an intellectual can become alienated and distanced from his own class origins. Okay, let's go back to the computer screen. We can move on now from talking about a little bit of background on West to talking about what he says about Emerson. And we've heard a little bit about Emerson with Dr. Mintz's introduction. Here's an illustration of Emerson, and I would like to just talk about some details of his life. Emerson, like many of the sort of Boston Brahmins with whom he grew up, was educated at Harvard, and he did his divinity school as well as his undergraduate work there. He was trained to be a minister, a Unitarian Universalist, and he did have a parish in Boston. However, at a certain point in his life, he began to have certain kinds of religious doubts and began in particular to have doubts about communion that led him to refuse to practice it anymore, and so he had to be dismissed from his parish. And he traveled to Europe subsequently, where he met a number of these people whose names you see here on the list, Coleridge, Carlyle, and Wordsworth. And the key word that you might associate with them is romanticism. And that will come in as a factor in Emerson's thought. We'll see that in just a minute. Upon his return to America in roughly 1835, he became the founder of the movement that Dr. Mintz mentioned, American Transcendentalism. And this movement is rather difficult to describe, but it does involve a certain kind of nature mysticism and individualism. And others who were associated with Transcendentalism include Thoreau, the utopian thinker Margaret Fuller, and the early American novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne. Some of Emerson's important works include Nature, which did elaborate his views about the position of man in nature. The American Scholar that Dr. Mintz mentioned, this was his Declaration of American Intellectual Independence. That's a phrase from Oliver Wendell Holmes. And then a number of his essays were published in collections as well as poems. And the most famous of his essays that you may have read is Self-Reliance. Emerson, of course, was friends with Thoreau, and I'm sure a lot of you have read Thoreau. I think Waldo is pretty much required reading in American high schools. I think it still is, even though I went to high school years ago. And I think that Waldo, Thoreau's book, exemplifies something of this nature philosophy of American Transcendentalism in Emerson. So I haven't actually brought in a quote to read you from Waldo. I'm assuming that you can remember, and here's the original cover of Waldo with the kind of little cabin that Thoreau built himself, and he kept his accounts and wrote it all up as a sort of testimonial to his own honest labor in creating this cabin from his own supplies and with the sweat of his own brow. And then he had chapters on the bean fields and his war against weeds and his earnest labor growing this product that he could sell. So I think that you can recall some of the things that Thoreau talked about, and the basic idea I'd like to emphasize is this thought of going out to the woods in order to find oneself. And Thoreau's most famous quote is this remark he made that most men lead lives of quiet desperation, and that's what he thought he was avoiding by going to the woods, and he was finding himself. And there's a passage where he talks about how if you just go out in the woods and sit on a stump, nature will reveal itself to you by turns. So there's an idea of this kind of purity of the intellectual having communion with nature. And there are many similar passages in Emerson, and to some extent these have a bit of an anti-intellectual flavor. And I'm going to share a couple of these passages from Emerson with you now. Here's one remark. The intellectual life may be kept clean and healthful if man will live the life of nature and not import into his mind difficulties which are none of his. No man need be perplexed in his speculations. Let him do and say what strictly belongs to him, and though very ignorant of books, his nature shall not yield him any intellectual obstructions and doubts. This is a little bit of what Cornel West is going to label his evasion of philosophy. And evading philosophy, let me predict for you, is not going to turn out to be an awful thing. It's not a completely blamable thing, according to West. And one more passage from Emerson talking about nature. Man is fallen, nature erect, and serves as a differential thermometer, detecting the presence or absence of the divine sentiment in man. We're waiting for a Freudian analysis of this statement. By fault of our dullness and selfishness, we are looking up to nature, but when we are convalescent, nature will look up to us. We see the foaming brook with compunction. If our own life flowed with the right energy, we should shame the brook. The stream of zeal sparkles with real fire and not with reflex rays of sun and moon. So if only man would go out in nature and emulate nature, we would flow like that brook, and we would not be impeded by all of those silly books that are getting in our way. And so we're going to sort of do away with that intellectual European ancestry. Could we go back to the computer screen, please? Thank you. Let's go back then to a little bit more about Emerson and Emerson's evasion of philosophy that we've been hearing a little bit about and you've been getting the flavor of. How and why Does Emerson evade modern philosophy? West explains as follows. This is a quote from his book. Emerson evades modern philosophy not because it is wrong, unjustified, or uninteresting, but rather because it is antiquated, anachronistic, and outdated relative to his chosen tasks. So there are new tasks for humans, and these have to do with us being in a new land with new challenges and new frontiers. And we will be hearing about those frontiers more as we continue in a moment. Let's continue exploring the evasion of philosophy that West talks about. West refers to Emerson as evading philosophy, where philosophy has a very particular kind of meaning. It's epistemology-centered. The term epistemology you may not be familiar with. It derives from two Greek roots, episteme and logos, and it refers to the theory of knowledge. This is a kind of philosophy or an approach or an emphasis in philosophy that I would say is paradigmatic of modernism. So we want to take a minute here and look at the people who were the proponents of this kind of philosophy, and those are Descartes and Kant. Descartes and Kant are often described as the founders or the fathers of modern philosophy. And here are some key hallmarks of modern philosophy, the way that in our discipline we would describe it. It has a focus on issues of knowledge and concern to avoid skepticism and to provide intellectual justification. So modernism begins with Descartes going into his studio in his meditations and trying to figure out what he can be certain of without accepting any inherited beliefs and without accepting things on the basis of someone else telling them to him, even though that person has a vested authority like a priest would have. So another characteristic is a reliance on science and on rationality. Human rationality alone will enable us to find answers to questions. We're not going to need to go to the church for dogmas and to holy texts. There's also an emphasis on individualism. Descartes doesn't need to go out and talk to people. In fact, he goes into his study, he withdraws into his own mind, and when he peeks out the window, he's so skeptical that he's not even sure that the people out there are real. They might just be automata strolling the street. So one looks into one's own intellectual consciousness, and I see this as coming into Emerson with a twist. And we'll get back to that later, but that comes into that's a strain of modernism that gets continued from the philosophers in Europe to Emerson and his Americanism. Another hallmark of modernism and philosophy is a conviction that reason will enable humans to make progress. We will be able to introduce moral improvements. We will advance the causes of democracy and civilization. A final hallmark is that there's this faith in reason goes in tandem with a kind of worry about emotions, a distrust about the emotions, or perhaps a relegation of emotions to only certain roles and certain tasks. And here are the dates and some illustrations of these two key fathers of philosophy, Descartes on your left, 1500s to 1600s, and Kant on the right. So he's a closer intellectual antecedent to Emerson. Kant is also a great fan of Rousseau, and as I've mentioned, there's this ambivalence about emotions. Many people think that Kant was such a rationalist that he did not recognize any important role for the emotions, but in fact he did. There were roles for emotions, but very limited ones. And reason should be our primary dictate in guiding ourselves in morality. And the emotions sort of should be restricted to particular spheres. For example, women could lead their lives and be moral in light of their emotions, provided that there was a sort of rational father or husband giving them advice so that they could have the right emotions in line with what the wise, rational philosopher told them. Okay, let's go back then to Emerson's evasion. Now, West actually thinks that this evasion of rational modernist philosophy in the form of Emerson is good. Let's look at why. Why is the evasion a good thing? And I have some quotations where West explains his view on this. Quote, "To evade modern philosophy means to strip the profession of philosophy of its pretense, disclose its affiliations with the structures of powers, both rhetorical and political, rooted in the past." Emerson wants individualism and individuals to look to themselves to stimulate their own kinds of creativity and their own questions. Next, Emerson refuses modern philosophy's quest for certainty and its hope for scientific respectability. So this is sort of the flip side of that ambivalence to the emotions. With Emerson, there's a way in which nature feeds our emotions. Think back to that image of the bubbling brook, inspiring us to have zeal and to have energy and to really reflect the bright light of the sun. And if we do all that, then we will exhibit a kind of rationality. So the emotions that are inspired by nature are inspired by a nature that itself has rationality in it. And you don't need to use the Cartesian method, some kind of quasi-geometrical method, to prove things like the existence of other humans or the existence of God or the existence of the outside world. So this is a good thing to evade the search for foundations. And finally, this evasion means to do what Emerson says and does in The American Scholar, being self-reliant by refusing, quote, to be captive or caught up in the problematic and vocabulary of those who came before. So you're going to start all afresh. Start out by yourself. Question from the audience. Yes?
I'd like to go back to the brook again, please. Just let me paraphrase so that I can understand a little bit more clearly. You were talking about how if you're in front of the brook and you're enjoying the sunlight and everything, and the emotions that arise from this natural setting they have their own inherent natural rationality about them. Is that what you said?
I think that the rationality of nature is a rationality of flux and flow and energy. And the worst thing for Emerson is to be static. And if you're caught up in the old traditions of Europe, you're static. So you look to the natural world around you, right there, Walden Pond. Just go out your door of your little hut, and the lake is flowing, and there's springs in it that are feeding this cold energy, and it's deep. And so nature itself has wisdom. And this is the philosophy of Transcendentalism. So there's a kind of rationality that's deeper than the rationality of science or mathematics. Does that help? Okay. Emerson was extremely influenced by Eastern philosophy. I'm very glad you've made that observation about how this sounds like Taoism. Emerson was a fond reader of the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita. He liked Hinduism, and this emphasis on flux and on man's unity with nature definitely comes out of some of his reading of Eastern mystical thinkers. Ironically, this is one of the things, Emerson's multicultural roots leading to his mysticism, that's one of the points that Cornel West criticizes. He criticizes Emerson for his mysticism, and we will see that later. What I've now got on the screen is an outline of 4 key sections of West's chapter on Emerson, and I would like to take these in order. So I will be going in order through the section on power and then on provocation. You'll notice that there's a sort of tension in each of these titles: personality versus race, provocation versus the market. We will go through these 4 in order, A through D, and then we'll go to some conclusions, and I will finish the lecture. And again, let me remind you, this is on the web, and so you can track through these in order if you go to the web page that I gave you at the start of the class today. The first one, A, I'll warn you, is the longest. So don't be dismayed when you see a lot of details on section A. The other ones are going to be much shorter, and if you look in West's chapter, section A is by far the longest. So power is really a key notion in Emerson, and power is one of the reasons why other philosophers later on, like Nietzsche, loved Emerson. Emerson was just about Nietzsche's favorite philosopher, and he was very fond of quoting from him. Which is interesting because Nietzsche is one of your archetypal postmodern philosophers, or a founder of postmodernism, so maybe I'll leave that for your professors to think about and discuss with you. Emerson's conception of power, look at how Cornel West describes it. Cornel West can really turn a phrase, can't he? Rapacious individualism and relentless expansionism. Are you getting the idea that power might be kind of a bad thing, according to Cornel West? You are right, if that's the idea you're getting. But this is part of his diagnosis of what Emerson's philosophy is and what the basis of its appeal to later thinkers in America is also going to be. First of all, he makes the observation that Emerson's notion of power is multi-leveled. That is, that power encompasses power on the grand macro level as well as power on the intimate micro level. So when Emerson celebrates power, it can be the power of the nation, its economy, individual people, certain traditions, which are going to be the new traditions we're going to ground here, and of language. So Emerson emphasizes the power of rhetoric and writing, and this is one of the reasons he wants to ground a new kind of literature and a new kind of American free expressive writing. And it's going to be, again, modeled after that bubbling brook. He celebrates the possession and expansion of certain kinds of power. And he relates a mythical self with the land of America. The idea of the expanding, powerful individual is linked to the idea of this fresh, new, zealous, virile nation, America. Next, Emerson is obsessed, as Cornel West phrases it, with sight and vision. And I would like to read another passage this is from West quoting from Emerson, and this is a passage you might not notice. It's rather peculiar and it's a little bit long, but it's quite important, so I do want to read this for you. This is the passage about the transparent eyeball. This is from Emerson. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am one particle of God. The name of the nearest friend sounds then foreign and accidental. To be brothers, to be acquaintances, master or servant, is then a trouble and a disturbance. I am the lover of uncontained and immortal beauty. In the wilderness, I find something more dear and connate than in streets and villages. In the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, man beholds somewhat as beautiful as his own nature. And this should also remind you of the passage on the bubbling brook and of his transcendentalism, his nature mysticism, his conviction that nature is rational and good. Could we have the computer screen back, please? Now, this obsession with sight and vision is troubling to Cornel West. It promotes separateness, detachment, individuality, rather than solidarity, association, and collective action. Notice how if you're just a transparent eyeball and you're one with God and nature, you don't care about your brothers or about masters and servants. And you don't care about slaves, and you don't care about Indians, and so on. And so it disassociates vision in this transcendental sense from politics, sociality, and materiality. These are very troubling to West. Now remember, we're on the topic of Emerson's views of power, and point 3 in Cornel West's section on this topic concerns Emerson's peculiar and individual version of the myth of the frontier, which I'm sure you've all heard about. Now, Emerson's version cuts geographical and cultural discourse into two: the metropolis versus civilization, wilderness versus savagery. However, things aren't so simple as they might seem. It's not just the case that civilization is in the city and savages are in the wilderness. Here's the subtle point B here. It associates progress in America with immigration out from the metropolis. That is, it's good, it's civilizing to leave the city and go to the woods. That sounds like a paradox. That sounds like the reverse of what you'd think. The woods is more civilizing than the city because nature is so wonderful. The frontiers, open, pure, and abundant spaces will have a transformative effect. So all the humans are getting evil and small-minded and greedy and corrupt by being stuck in cities, so they should go out in nature where there's just abundant, pure, virgin land and make themselves one with that land, and that's great. That's the goal. And of course, Cornel West's point of view on this is critical because this is a view that suggests that there's nothing out there now and that one should just appropriate these virgin resources of nature and use them to feed one's own power. The next point, and the last point in this part of the chapter about power, concerns the fact that Emerson did feel guilty over his own political inactivity. He felt that his nature was to be a solitary contemplative person. He did not join in the Brook Farm utopian experiment of his friend Margaret Fuller, and he felt guilty over this. "I'm not a joiner," he said. He wanted the best of two worlds, according to West: bourgeois prestige and also solitary contemplation. He was blinded to the misery of working people like the Irish. So you'll see quotes in Cornel West's chapter where Emerson's walking down the streets in New York and he sees the Irish getting off the boat, and he says, in a few months they'll have worked hard and they'll earn new clothes and they'll dress better and they'll be more civilized. Isn't that great? And Cornel West says that Emerson's mysticism is the missing key to his lack of activism. That transparent eyeball passage is very revealing in that regard. If you feel so wonderfully unified with God and nature, why do you need to go out and be an activist? Now, this is not to say that Emerson was sort of totally an ivory tower intellectual. Emerson did try to take certain political action. He did write to President Van Buren and denounce the Cherokee Indian relocation, but he then didn't do anything else, and it didn't really have any effect, so then he chided himself and felt guilty over his own inactivity. We've now looked at Part A of West's chapter, and the other sections will be shorter, so I can be briefer in summarizing them. Part B concerns Emerson's views on provocation and the market. Emerson saw himself as being kind of like Socrates was to Athens. His goal was to provoke, the way that Socrates was the gadfly, provoking Athens to rethink its morality and its assumptions. So Emerson's goal of provocation, according to West, actually chimes in very well with the goals of American market economy, and industrial capitalism is just getting going. It's just on the rise at this time period of Emersonian philosophy. So the emphasis on all the goals that Emerson had for personal power really fit very nicely. They dovetail well with market goals, things like activity and domination. Other goals such as the emphasis on flux and contingency. The market is just this place where you gamble and you take risks, and risks are good, according to Emerson. So the person who's living out this Emersonian ethic will be a person who fits in very well into the capitalist ethos of the developing North American economy. There's also a kind of cutting yourself away from a clear sense of the past, of traditions. You don't have the tradition of a European aristocracy to worry about. a person can go out there and be a self-made millionaire. So there's no clear destiny. There's just an open field for you to go in, and whoever you are, you can make your own future. And that's his view both for a person on an individual level, and it's also a view that rationalizes people participating in the market economy. And finally, as I've mentioned, this is a philosophy that emphasizes the dangerousness, but the beauty of the dangers of emphasizing power domination, even though it may cause you to have risks and losses. So all of these are points of comparison that West thinks do hold true on a deep level. That is, these are ideological justifications of market economics, even though you can find many passages where Emerson critiqued the market. So he criticized the market on one level, but what West is saying is that on another level, the kind of ethos that he advocated would be usable by later people, by later capitalists, to justify their own endeavors. Part C of West's chapter addresses Emerson's views on personality. This part of the chapter contains what are surely the most disturbing selections from Emerson that run very much counter to the view that we all learned in high school about this great American father. Though Emerson emphasizes human equality, he has in mind a certain kind of a subject, and Emerson does provide justification for this claim: a white male bourgeois subject, occasionally a white female subject, but usually it's male. And although Emerson fought for abolition, he did buy into what were then the best available scientific, quote-unquote, theories about race, and in particular about how the Africans were an intermediate kind of creature between the beasts and humans. And there are a number of passages that he quotes from Emerson to illustrate that this claim is in fact true. But not only were Africans lower, it turns out that Emerson held a kind of view about history and racial destiny and fate that goes along with this nature mysticism that, you know, I am one with nature and nature is running its own course and I'm kind of fated to be this part of nature. And it turns out that there's a certain race that's got superiority, and lo and behold, it's the Saxon race. And he refers to this as an imperial race, and there are passages Cornel West quotes that illustrate it's superior not only to Africans, but also Mexicans, Irish, and Chinese. And so I would like to share with you these brief passages. This is from Cornel West. The first one is from page 30. The duty to our fellow man, the slave. We are to assert his right in all companies. An amiable, joyous race, who for ages have not been permitted to unfold their natural powers, we are to befriend. So notice this air of condescension, noblesse oblige. We're the Saxons, we'll help this joyous, happy, lower race. And then he says, I think it cannot be maintained by any candid person that the African race have ever occupied or do promise ever to occupy any very high place in the human family. Their present condition is the strongest proof that they cannot. Just look at them, there they are. The Irish cannot, the American Indian cannot, the Chinese cannot. Before the energy of the Caucasian race, all the other races have quailed and done obeisance. And then there's a kind of paired passage about the inherent superiority of the imperial Saxon race. He refers to this race as a race which nature cannot bear to lose, and after cooping it up for 1,000 years in yonder England, gives 100 Englands, 100 Mexicos, all the bloods it shall absorb and domineer, and more than Mexicos, the secrets of water and steam. Now notice we're going from racial conquest of the lower peoples to conquest of nature, and this is something that is in a bit of tension with that nature mysticism and that oneness with nature. There's one of those inconsistencies that we're going to dismiss as hobgoblins of small minds. Okay, let me go back to my quote. All the bloods it shall absorb and domineer, and more than Mexico's, the secrets of water and steam, the spasms of electricity, the ductility of metals, the chariot of the air, the ruddered balloon are awaiting you. So this fits with what I was describing as Emerson's own myth of the frontier. We're going to go out, this imperial Saxon race, into the frontier, and we're going to, tame its metals, and we're going to fly through its air, and we're going to control the streams and the electricity, and it's a very grandiose vision. Let's return to the computer screen. Thank you. The final section of West's chapter on Emerson concerns Emerson as an organic intellectual. This is a phrase I've mentioned before that West likes. It's good to be an organic intellectual, and he would like to think that he himself is an organic intellectual. What does it mean to say this? Well, one thing is that Emerson's themes, such as individuality, idealism, voluntarism, optimism, amelioration, and experimentation, prefigure those of American pragmatism. So these are all themes that reach out from the arid intellectual territory of the ivory tower and provide a kind of rationale that the whole culture can adopt. It's going to reach out and be the kind of grounding faith of many, many subsequent generations of philosophers, right up to figures like West himself and Richard Rorty nowadays. Secondly, here's another quote from West. Emerson conceived of his project as a form of power, a kind of provocation, and of himself as an indomitable person whose very presence, that is, activity, changed the world. That is to say, being an organic intellectual means you're connected. That's really the key thing. You're connected to your culture, you're inspiring art, you're dealing with moral and social problems of the day, you're speaking to those issues. Let's now go, this is the last section of my lecture for today, to some conclusions. What can we get from West on Emerson, on philosophy? We've got a lot of kind of iterations or ramifications here. Well, let me remind you, let's review a little bit. Remember at the beginning I said, why Cornel West? Let's just go back and look at that page. Let me remind you. Well, he's connecting Emerson to European modernism in one intellectual frame of philosophy, one discipline. He's also really pinpointing Emerson as the author of an American identity. Emerson links philosophy, this is part of his being an organic intellectual, he links philosophy to religion, art, and individual personalities, and West is critical of many of Emerson's views. And let's also remember, why was evasion good? Because we're going to take philosophy away from its pretenses, and we're going to really look at how intellectual ideas go along with power, and we're not going to get stuck in this dry epistemological quest for certainty and rational foundations. We're going to be flowing rather than dry. Now, here are some of the key things that West criticizes in Emerson. Obviously, he's very critical of the racial views. I've just quoted a few selections, and there are others in the chapter. And it's not simply that there are sort of views that are unpalatable due to that time period, but also it's a whole entire picture of racial destiny and fate that West thinks is very unacceptable. He's critical of Emerson's individualism, and that's really tied to this next point that he attacks, Emerson's mysticism and his inactivity. It's partly because Emerson cares more about his own individual power and his own individual inspiration by nature that he doesn't care about the collective, about the poor Irish, about the Mexicans who are victims of conquest, the Cherokees being relocated. He doesn't care enough to really do anything to change the situation. And the real worry here is that all of this justifies American imperialism, conquest of the wilderness, expansion, and aggression. Now, it would be pretty easy to leave you with that and to just say, yes, here's Cornel West, prominent current African-American intellectual denouncing a great American white father for his racist views. But no, I really would like to emphasize West is much more subtle than that. As a philosopher, he and we in our discipline are all indebted to Emerson. And there's some things that he thinks are good in Emerson. So I'm going to conclude with these things that West finds admirable from Emerson. Creativity. This is a good thing. The quest for personal self-mastery and self-challenge. This is a goal of a lot of existential philosophers, postmodern thinkers that West thinks is fine. Provocation. I'm sure Cornel West sees himself as a provocateur trying to provoke the white establishment, among other things, concern for racial injustice in America. And finally, the goal of being an organic intellectual is one that Cornel West himself subscribes to. And this comes out in some of the books that I mentioned of his at the beginning of my lecture, where he's concerned to try to locate American intellectual ideas and position them in relation to current pressing American economic, racial, and social problems. So let me once again remind you, my notes are on the website, and I do have all the course notes for my course on American philosophy that I taught last semester on that website as well. So you might want to check this out. If you didn't get it, you might want to make a note of it now, and you can run through the materials. And there are a few other linked websites concerning Emerson, Thoreau, and Cornel West that you would have the opportunity to peruse at your own leisure. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that we're now open for some questions, some dialogue, some challenges from our team teachers here, so I'm happy to oblige.
Well, let me start out with one for you.
All right.
Usually, Emerson would be treated simply in a literature class, and most students at the University of Houston would encounter Emerson in a literature class. Perhaps you could say a few words why they should encounter Emerson instead in a philosophy course.
Emerson is just sort of uncategorizable, and he inherits a tradition. I mean, if you think of a philosopher as someone who belongs in a tradition with philosophers, he both was influenced by and has influenced people who clearly count as philosophers. This is actually a sort of more provocative question than you might know, because there is a contemporary philosopher at Harvard University, Stanley Cavell, and I'll just write his name down. And he has written a number of essays on both Emerson and Thoreau. He's written books on each of them, in which he argues that America has this continuing, still in 1997, continuing sense of our intellectual inferiority, and we don't claim people as philosophers even though they are philosophers. So he actually thinks it's a term of sort of, it's an honorific to call somebody like Emerson or Thoreau a philosopher, and he has written about how each of them are concerned with questions about knowledge and value and justification that really link them to figures like Descartes and Kant. And because they were so influential on subsequent thinkers like Nietzsche, they are important and they are worth looking at.
Why should we continue to engage people like Emerson today? I mean, now that Cornel West has written about him, is there a reason to continue to criticize or examine his works?
Well, in philosophy, we continue to examine all the people from, Plato on. So you may be asking the wrong person.
No.
You engaged with them because they were important and influential. And if you look at them through a new lens, if you look at Emerson through the lens of, as you suggested, New Age philosophy, you can see how New Age philosophy has older roots. And you can see its roots all the way back through Emerson to Indian philosophy. And if you look at Emerson through the lens of race, you can see that race problems in the U.S. have very deep roots. I think in philosophy we think that addressing problems requires a pretty deep understanding of the source of those problems, and I'm sure that's what Cornel West thinks. And again, I really do agree with Cornel West that Emerson's goal of being an organic intellectual is an admirable goal. And you might disagree with the particular kind of ethic that he advocated, But the fact that he was effective and that he could speak in a way that people found accessible, that they found rhetorically powerful, he influenced people, not just sort of some one person who read one journal article one time. That's a good goal for all intellectuals, I think.
There's a question that I'd like to ask you, which you were not prompted ahead of time, and so I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the spur of the moment. When one thinks of who are the really great American philosophers, that is, people who have helped shape our public philosophy as opposed to academic philosophers, one thinks of Jefferson or Emerson. And in both cases, one point that I find quite striking about them is their inability to confront deep-seated contradictions in American society.
Right.
So that on the one hand, Jefferson could talk about equality and liberty for all at the same time that he was one of the largest slaveholders in Virginia. And he could somehow exist with this contradiction.
Right.
Emerson, similarly, sets up the highest ideal of individualism as self-fulfillment and self-reliance, and yet also had difficulty engaging the real concrete problems of his society. Is there something characteristically, can we use the word American here? Or are these just two idiosyncratic individuals who happen to be quite influential?
You could probably find intellectual figures of this time period who might challenge them on some of these points. For example, I think Thoreau had much sort of stronger and deeper convictions about the evils of racism and of slavery. However, I would be hesitant to say that this is just a sort of peculiar American problem of blindness, because there are great European revolutionaries like Marx and Rousseau who don't see the problems of sexism. And so being a revolutionary in one sphere does not necessarily mean that one escapes one's assumptions in another sphere. And I think that's a sort of cautionary tale for all of us. You know, what are our assumptions? We are trying to formulate new kinds of value systems and critiques of inherited value systems that we see as problematic. But in the meantime, what are our own assumptions that future generations will chide us for not considering?
Very interesting. Kitsil?
Professor Castaneda, I think, also has some issues to raise. And you students, you can raise questions too. Okay, one from the audience. Very good.
This sort of relates to your last point here. It was interesting for me to hear the link between Emerson and I guess the point that Wes makes, relating to the kind of subsequent domination of nature and movement west into the wilderness and so forth. On the contrary, with my own experience and my undergraduate years with environmental studies and so forth, we often looked at Emerson as sort of the prophet to the new eras in environmentalism, say with the creation of the national parks in 1960s and so forth. And I'm wondering if Wes looks at this kind of aspect of Emerson contribution, or if that is...
He does not spend very much time on this topic in his chapter, and I agree with you that there seems to be a bit of a tension there. What I went over when I talked about how he describes Emerson as having a twist on the myth of the frontier, that is his response. So the twist is to say, and I think he would say this about Thoreau and Waldo just as much as Emerson, the twist is to say that, yes, we can look at these figures as founders of environmentalism, but on the other hand, they are going out to nature in order to appropriate nature for their own ends. And so the environmentalists really should be cautious in looking to them as their founding fathers, because this kind of appropriation of nature is troubling. This is the idea that nature is just this kind of, I think he actually treats it as this sort of this female source of energy feeding the male creative artist philosopher, writer, poet, thinker. So even though Thoreau says, I'm going to sit on this stump and let nature show herself to me, that reduces nature to the sort of spectacle for the entertainment of a man. Or maybe not, maybe that's too crude, but nature is the spectacle to serve for the edification of the man. So it's all zeroing in on this one man sitting on a stump. It's there for me, and I've learned its lesson. I have read nature. He has many, many passages that refer to reading nature like a book. Well, if you know the book of nature, then I take it that you're a little bit superior. Professor Castaneda.
Yes, following up on a couple of questions. In a sense, you just answered my lead-in question, but I'd like to ask it again or verify and tie it up to your question here and Steve's question. My initial question was if you would confirm that, in fact, nature is sexed. That, and what you've just said is that there is a gendering of nature, absolutely female, right? The brook bubbling, the virgin land to be taken by the masculine. Yet a certain, and then on the other side of the story is the city, which implicitly seems to be masculine because it is civilizing that which is coming in. The savages, the colored savages of Europe, Irish, who else? Italians, all the coloreds, European coloreds that we take to be white today. And so this masculine city is civilizing these savages that are coming from zones of savagery. And on the other, no?
No, I think that it's more subtle than that because the city is always at risk. The city is not inherently good. The city is this sort of site of infection. And all the immigrants coming in are going to feed the infection, and so you have to go out into the pure air of the country to escape infection. So I don't think the city is really going to civilize them because the city itself won't be civilized unless it's getting its lesson from nature. And that's why you have these passages where you're going out and sitting on the stump, or you're hoeing your bean field, or you're sitting by the brook, or you're walking across the common at night with nothing but you and your bare head and the cold air, and you're a transparent eyeball, because you can't have that kind of exposure in the crowded city that's full of all these people. So the city in itself is full of risks, and it feeds greed and corruption, and he's actually very concerned about that, and it's only the wilderness that will save the city, and hence the people in it. Another question from the students?
Did he ever talk about, it's almost as if he had a great fear of wide difference between people.
Of difference?
Yeah.
Emerson, you mean? Yes.
Because if the cities were infected, and there's so many different kinds of people there, and you go out to be solitary, and you can be civilized in a solitary way.
I mean, you could say, and Cornel West partly says this is partly a matter of temperament, somebody who just likes spending time alone, somebody who's had hard times in his life with the wife and a son dying of diseases, but also this theory of racial destiny there are some people who are like happy and innocent, but they're inferior. So they're not necessarily bad, the Africans and the Irish, but they're innocent and they need to have their level raised. And he actually advocated a kind of intermarriage, so racial interbreeding, to raise the level. And that's because presumably the imperial Saxon blood would improve things. Any other questions? Yes, kind of.
One question that I would like to ask, implicit in all of your discussion here, is the issue of, well, I guess we're closing down, but it seems to me that what you're raising very much is this issue of the causal circuitry or the pathways, for example, between of modernism to Europe, from Europe to the Americas, and then even implicitly you gave us little fragments of the question of, well, Emerson as a precursor to postmodernism. So what we're seeing is a questioning, ultimately, of the pathway, the causal circuitry of modern culture and civilization. Would you, in final seconds, say something about this, perhaps?
Well, this is partly because Cornel West, we have a perspective that's different, so this might be something he himself couldn't see. But he traveled to Europe, and he was critical of things he saw there, and the Americans were quite conscious in their own day of trying to strike out and be independent. And I think America then got seen as this sort of source of fresh, abundant new energy. So somebody like Nietzsche, who's trying to rebel against the very same people that Emerson was trying to rebel against, can look outside of Europe to some other source in order to ground his own sort of rebellion.
Well, very good.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Excellent.
Thank you all. I enjoyed it.